Good day. Welcome back. This is our third week of this particular class series on shadows. I'm glad you're able to join us today. Like the other classes, it is going to be partly done for the elementary or younger and partly done for the adults, but you are certainly welcome to participate in any part. I've been enjoying it. We've been doing the shadows, and in this discussion of the shadows, I've stated that I believe that the entire Old Testament is a prophecy in that it will shadow in some way Jesus Christ. So we're working through some of our examples. We spent 2 weeks already. We focused on the first week on the Passover, where the shadow in that story is the lamb itself. The lamb is the shadow of Jesus, and that it's going to be the sacrifice in whose blood that will mark his people to be spared when the day when the God returns to the earth on his final day. The second week, we focused again with the story related to Moses. Moses turning the water into blood on the first of the plagues of Egypt. And we did discuss a little bit the other plagues. And this week again, we're going to do one more with Moses and ask you, gave you this information last week, Moses is going to get water from the rock. So the question is, what part of this story is the shadow of Jesus himself? That's always our first task. And remember to look for interesting things. Remember what we talked about? Certain roles, but also in today's example, it will be about very odd instructions. Why did the instruction to Moses change from one time to the second time? We'll talk about that in a minute. But if you're ready, let's get ready. And we got Ashley and Larry today, Miss Ashley and Mr. Larry. They're in costume, and they're going to present to us the story of Moses as he gets water from the rock.
Good morning, Central. Thank you for joining us with Channel 407 News. I am Lola Lewis, and today we have a very special guest. I'd like to introduce to you the Moses from the Bible. He's traveled over time, space, continents, heavens, oceans, you name it. So glad you're here with us today, Moses.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here today. How I got here today, I'm not exactly sure, but apparently you have friends in high places.
I am well connected. Now, Moses, you're best known as the author of 5 of the most important books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. What was your inspiration for writing these stories?
Yes, I did write the first 5 books of the Old Testament, but the truth is, all Scripture is God-breathed, and as much as I'd like to take the credit, I simply recorded what God told me.
I see. There must be a lot of important lessons in your stories. Can you correct? Is that correct?
Yes, more than I can count. And since time is a little limited, which ones would you like to focus on?
Well, we'd like to hear more about your time with the Israelites. These last few weeks we've been studying about the first plague, which was when you turned blood into water, or water into blood, if you recall.
Yes.
And then you also did the last plague that we studied, which was the Passover. And so, how did you find yourself in such a position to have these plagues going on?
Well, truth be told, I didn't want to do any of it. But God insisted that I help His people and help my people too. I resisted God, but finally I gave into His will. And all of the amazing things I did were because God was working through me. God has great plans for all of us, and He can use us as long as we're willing to listen and obey Him.
Is it always easy to listen to and obey God?
No, it is not always easy to obey God. There were times when I followed Him to a T, but I recall one instance in particular where I didn't follow his instructions.
Can you tell us more about that incident?
Well, at some point we escaped from the Egyptians, and so the Israelites rejoiced at their deliverance and newfound freedom from slavery. It was fun times. They had seen God do miraculous things, and they knew that He had heard their prayers. But it didn't take long for them to start worrying and complaining. And after about 3 days into our desert travels, we were without water, and we ended up finding water, but it was very bitter. But God provided a way whenever we needed, and He always made sure our needs were met. He showed me a piece of wood after I found some water that was bitter. He showed me a piece of wood and told me to throw it in the water. I listened and obeyed, and the water was drinkable and very good.
Fascinating. But you said that you didn't listen and obey, and in that circumstance or instance, you did. So I feel like there's more to your story here.
Yes, once we got the water, the Israelites began to complain about being hungry and needing food, just like with the water. God provided them with manna and quail from heaven 6 out of the 7 days a week, so their needs were met again.
Manna, what is it?
Exactly. What is it?
Okay. How incredible that God can make something out of nothing. Go on.
Yes. Well, that brings me to my next point. He even made water come out of a rock.
But there's no water in rocks. Rocks are solid. They don't have liquid inside them.
Listen, all I know is that the Israelites needed water again and immediately started complaining and demanding that God give them water. I asked, "What are you complaining? Why are you complaining against me? Why are you trying to test the Lord?" But they didn't listen to me. Instead, they argued and complained and even questioned why God brought them out of Egypt.
Did they forget that they were slaves in Egypt?
Apparently so. They were getting hostile. So I called out to God asking, what should I do with these people? They were ready to stone me. I mean, it's just crazy. And I remember God telling me to get my special staff and gather up the elders. I distinctly remember Him saying, I will stand before you on the rock of Mount Sinai. Strike the rock, and water will come gushing out. Then the people will be able to drink. I obeyed this exactly as the Lord had instructed, and He provided water for all the elders, all the Israelites, and their livestock.
Wow. That must have been a lot of water.
It was. It was.
But you're glad you obeyed.
There was enough water, and it just kept gushing out. Now, that was in Massa during our first year in the wilderness.
Okay, Moses, so I'm still kind of confused. Because again, you said you disobeyed, but you're only talking about your obedience. So when did the disobedience happen?
Well, it was a similar situation, but this was about 40 years later.
Okay.
Much had happened since then, but we were still wandering around in the wilderness. And again, we had no water. So the grumbling and complaining started all over again. My brother and I went before God at the tabernacle. He appeared before us and said to take Aaron's staff this time and stand before the Israelites. I remember it clearly now. As he said, "As the people watch, speak to the rock over there, and it will pour out its water." But this time, I didn't listen and obey his instructions.
Why not? You knew that it would work, so why didn't you listen and obey? You had the model time from before.
I'm not quite sure. God said it was because I didn't trust Him enough to demonstrate His holiness to the Israelites. So instead, I shouted at the Israelites instead of the rock, and I struck the rock twice with the staff like I did 40 years ago. It worked still. I didn't obey, but it still worked. And so I thought it was all good. Water came gushing out, and again, the people and the livestock had enough to drink.
But was it? I mean, what was so bad about what you did?
Well, not listening to God, not listening and obeying God has its consequences. And my consequence was not being permitted to the promised land. So after 40 years of wandering, my disobedience cost me greatly.
How disappointing.
Yeah, it was a disappointing moment. But my story does not end there. God even let me make an appearance before Jesus, and when he was walking as a man on earth. You can check it out in the New Testament. And I tell you, that Jesus, he's the real rock we depend on. He is who was and is to come, the solid rock of our faith.
Yes, I do believe in that Jesus you're talking about, and he is more than remarkable. I've tried to be wise and make him the foundation of my faith. Thank you for joining us today, Moses. Sadly, that's all the time we've got. So this is going to be the end of our interview. But thank you again. And you had a valuable lesson, so thank you for sharing that with us.
Welcome.
This is Lola Lewis with Channel 407 News, signing off.
Well, we're back. I hope you found that interesting, and it's certainly a very intriguing story. So this story goes like this, and you've just heard the Rices tell it to us, and it goes, there are two major events, one of them at the very, very beginning of the time that the children of Israel were in the wilderness. They had just left Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, and within a very short amount of time, it's not real clear, but probably within a week or two, this event happens. And the event is they are thirsty. Well, that's easy to imagine if you've ever seen pictures of Sinai in the desert. It's like an easy place to get thirsty, especially with thousands of people and their animals. So they begin to complain, and they're grumbling and whining and carrying on about water. You certainly understand the thirst, but they are now starting to associate this as punishment and wishing they were back in Egypt. So Moses is a wee bit exasperated, as you might expect. And so he goes before the Lord and he asks what to do. And God gives him a very intriguing instruction. He is at Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. Either one is called. He's to take his staff, the same staff that he turned the water to blood, same staff that turned into a snake. He's to take that staff and he's to go up to a rock there at Mount Horeb, and he's to hit the rock with his staff. Moses did so, and out of that rock came a gigantic gushing of water. And that water was so significant, like you heard Moses say in the previous lesson with the Rices, that it was able to quench the thirst of all the people and all the animals. So that is a lot of water coming out of a rock. And so that was his first instruction. What we see, though, and that is found in Exodus, and what we see in the book of Numbers, and I hope you have your handout. It's right. We have the verses listed right here. Should have been sent out to you Friday. So as toward the end of the wandering, that's wandering, Moses is now seeing the end, and the people are still unhappy. Well, 40 years of walking around that desert would certainly be stressful. We spent 3.5 months with coronavirus issues, and we talk about being crazy, but can you imagine 40 years of that exposed to the elements, eating the same food most every day? So yes, they're irritated. And you certainly understand that Moses is irritated too. Not only that, at this event, his sister had just passed away. She has died, they bury her, and so he is now still in some state of mourning. And as the people, they find this desert, as people begin to complain viciously, hard complaining. Moses is now exasperated. He approaches God and said, they're going to stone me if you don't do something. Help, this is awful. They're ungrateful, and on and on and on. And God gives Moses another instruction. There's another rock nearby, and God tells Moses to go to that rock and to speak to the rock. Now, I have to admit, I've always wondered, what does one say to a rock? Hey, rock, give me some water. I don't know what it was he was to say. Those instructions are not given, but Moses is at his wit's end. And so you've dealt with people who've had family pass away, or who have been under a lot of work stress, and we forgive, we look past outbursts. And Moses had a world-class outburst. He turns to the people and he says, must we bring water out of the rock? I guess claiming some ability to do it himself. He then struck the rock. Unlike the first time, 40 some odd years earlier, he strikes a rock with his staff, and amazingly, the water came out. So God did not withhold from his people the sinful actions of one of his servants. The water pours out, and like before, is sufficiently enough to quench the thirst of all these people, which we assume have gotten larger. We may not have. Children have been born, but several probably died by now, and enough to fill their animals. So it's an intriguing story. It's a frustrating story, actually. It's the first thing that I think, when I learned of this story, you almost say, that was I didn't tell you the part that's important. So as is, God says to Moses, because you did not trust me. And it's pretty explicit. We've always wondered, what did Moses do wrong? Yes, he disobeyed. And they all sort of claimed arrogance and all sorts of other things. But the book of Numbers tells us the exact wording. Verses chapter 20, and we're going to look down toward the end. Verse 12, toward the middle of the chapter. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. I've always found that to be disheartening. Think about it. Think about all that Moses had done. He is one of the great leaders, one of the great men of all time, certainly of the Bible story. He acted in faith. He repeatedly begged God not to punish the people. He went before him and pleaded his case, much like an intercessor. He parted seas. He delivered plagues. He obeyed under stress. He was never apparently loved by his own people. 40 years of grumbling would be tiresome. His sister just passed away. Everything that would cause stress, Moses seemed to have. Do we tend to be forgiving of such things? And the answer is, I think we should. We are, and we should. If someone yells at you, bites at you, when you know they're under a lot of stress, what do? We just if we're good, we just let it go. Just let it go. But yet God said no. And it's a tough one to hear. And so God did not change his mind. And you'll read later in Deuteronomy, when the opportunity to cross into the promised land, Moses does not go. He stays on the other side of the Jordan. And they says he died there in the mountains and God buried him. The only person in the Bible that God describes as God himself burying. So Moses did not go to the promised land. So this is a stressing story. But let's look at it again as not as just a story by itself, but as a shadow. So one of the rules I have to find these shadows is one of the things I look for are odd instructions. And one of the oddest instructions of all, clearly the oddest one in this whole story is, why change the instruction? Why was God so explicit about striking the first time and speaking the second time? Clearly God did not need Moses to do either one. So it's not Moses' power. God could have done it through any act of faith. It was an act of faith, right? Because if people come to you, if your children come to you and say, I'm thirsty, and your next step is to grab a rock and smack it, your children are going to think you're having a tantrum. They don't think you're about to give them something to drink. And so you have to have faith, because that does not sound like a solution to the problem. To fill the thirst of thousands of people and animals, talking to rocks or hitting rocks does not sound like an answer. So he acted in faith, didn't he? So it's an act of faith. But in this second story, the second part, Moses did not act in faith. God said, this will work, and Moses decided that something else would be better, and so he strikes the rock. Now, like I said, the intriguing part, one of the things that still have somewhat shocked me, is that God let the water come out. Because I don't think God's going to punish the people, though they probably deserve punishment. Remember, there's a reason they're in the desert for 40 years. They have not responded with faith. They've only responded with complaining. But they got the water anyway. But Moses was not allowed into the promised land. So that seems fairly severe. So let's look at the shadow. Can you see the shadow? Do you know where this shadow is? So I'm going to show you where I think that this is a shadow of. And you heard Ashley actually talk about it. So Jesus is the rock. Now we know that he is our rock of our salvation. He is what we build like the rock we build a house on. All those kinds of things. But this is more than just that. He is really, truly the rock. So let's look at why I believe this. And let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And this is actually a passage written by Paul to the church in Corinth, in which he actually gives us a pair of shadows, but we'll just look at one of them. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1. And let's look at the first 4 verses. And Paul is speaking to the church. He says, "For I do not want you to be ignorant of this fact, brothers, that our forefathers were all under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea." Now that's a reference to the crossing of the Red Sea. So if you remember the story, the Red Sea parts, got water on both sides, and the cloud is over the top of them. So they're underwater, and there's water's on the side. That means they are in the water, though not touching it directly. They passed through the sea. Verse 2, they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. So what is this? This crossing the Red Sea is a shadowing of baptism. And that this baptism is going to take them from, what were they leaving? Bondage and slavery, or bondage to sin. They're going to come through baptism, come through the Red Sea, and when they come into the wilderness, where are they? So they are free, but in a world that's not the promised land. So that's what exactly happens to us. We come from the bondage of sin, we enter baptism, we come out, we're still in this world, the world still decays, but we are free from that bondage. But the people who came through that Red Sea look back to Egypt with pleasure and joy. They never let go of their sin. They preferred the bondage of sin. So that's our first shadow. So didn't even build my class around that today, but I just thought I'd give you that one. Verse 3, let's continue on. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, For they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. There's our shadow. So this is a very good time because the New Testament writer gives it to us very clearly. The rock that Moses struck was Jesus. And if you ever notice shadows in the New Testament, they never say like the rock or he's like the Passover lamb. He is the Passover lamb and he is the rock. So let's go back and look at our story again. Now that we've got it, Jesus identified in the story, let's see if we can't piece it together. If the rock is Jesus, then Moses struck the rock and out came water. And the second time he was supposed to speak to the rock and to get his water, right? That's what we should be looking for. And so we can find those equivalents in the New Testament. So I'll, if you will, get my verses back together. In John the 19th chapter, when was Jesus struck and out came water? And so when he's on the cross, Jesus has died. It is about to be the Passover. The Jewish leaders want the bodies taken down. They ask that they break the legs because that's how they can, the pressure on their legs can keep them from suffocating, which is how crucifixion ultimately works. But Jesus was already dead. So they did not break his bones. Like the Passover lamb in the book of Exodus, no bones were broken. Jesus' bones were not broken. When they came to him, a Roman soldier took his spear and pierced him in the side. And what do you remember from the story? John 19, verse 34, out came water and blood. So he was struck, and out came water. That certainly looks like our shadow, doesn't it? But what we need to be sure is to find the second one. So that is, in this habit, this is a Roman tradition. This is Roman soldiers training. When they move across the battlefield after a battle, they'll take their spears and they will stab those who appear dead to make sure they are. And that's what this Roman soldier has done. But very key, out came the water. Zechariah 12, an Old Testament prophet, in verses 10, I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication, kind of a big word. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves a firstborn son. So Zechariah was prophesying the piercing of the Messiah, in this case Jesus, and couple that with the shadow of Moses, it's starting to look like this is the same thing as Moses striking the rock. Did Moses strike the rock the first time with God's permission? And the answer is yes. So was Jesus allowed to be crucified? And the answer is yes. God permitted his crucifixion. Remember, Jesus would say, that he goes willingly. If he did not want to be on that cross, I guarantee you, he could have gotten off that cross. So it was a willingness and a permission to be pierced or more clearly crucified. So we now need the second rock. So where was it? So if you look in the book of John chapter 4, the 10th verse, we have a story that's fairly well known among people who grew up in church and have heard a lot of stories. But if you haven't, and you're still pretty new to the Lord, this is a great story. You read it real quickly. It's in one chapter, the 4th chapter of the Gospel of John. And in this story, Jesus is in Samaria. He is traveling back and forth between Galilee and Judah. And he stops at a well to get water, again with the water. And so a woman, he has no jar, he has nothing to dip down into the well. His disciples have walked away. A woman comes up from Samaria, and she has the equipment to get this water out. She has these jars and pitchers, and she needs to lower them in. And Jesus asked her for a drink. Very similar to our other story with Moses. He doesn't complain, but he begins to ask her for water. And then the discussion goes back because she's a little surprised that a Jewish man will speak to a Samaritan woman. And they begin to talk, and Jesus said to her, if you knew who was talking to you, you would ask him, and he would give you living water. So this is an intriguing set of words. How does she get the water from Jesus? Not with pitchers and not with ropes to drag down into wells. How does she get the water from Jesus? She must ask. She must speak to the rock. And so I believe that this is the second one. And from this point on, after the crucifixion, if you want living water, you must ask Jesus for the living water. But what you may not do is strike him a second time. Because what Moses did, if Jesus is that rock, he crucified him the first time with God's permission, and he's not allowed to do it a second time. We do not crucify our Lord a second time. So I believe these are the two shadows that put the story together. That Jesus is going to be crucified, which Moses acted out with the first receipt of water, and then he's supposed to ask the rock for water, and Moses got angry and struck him. That's gets us most of the way there, doesn't it? But there's one more part of the story that we've not yet accounted for. And so this is one that took me the longest to figure out. And so the story ends with Moses, with his being denied permission to enter the promised land. So if I've already told you about the baptism, right? So Egypt represents our sinful world, where we lived in sin, we were bondage to sin. Through baptism, the parting of the Red Sea, we came to this world, and we've got some time that we wander around, waiting for their chance to go into the promised land. When the promised land opportunity comes up, the Jordan will part, and they'll pass through into the promised land. And these three places represent three places to us, spiritual places. Sin, our Christian walk on this earth, and our reward in heaven represent the promised land. And the crossing of the Red Sea is baptism, and the crossing of the Jordan is death itself, burial again. And so, from a symbolic sense, Moses didn't get to the promised land. That sounds terrible. And it seems amazing. So can we get that? Is that the way it ended? Moses unable to enter the promised land. And so if you ask anyone, did Moses get to the promised land? Your answer is no. But I do not believe the answer is complete. So if you would, I want to read this passage, Mark chapter 9. It's recorded in multiple Gospels, but I'll read Mark's account. Mark, the chapter 9, verses 2 through 4. And Jesus has Peter, James, and John with him. After 6 days, verse 2, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up to a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them being the four, Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. So we know this story. The word transfigured means to go from one to another. And so figure means your shape. Your body has changed from one form, its human form, to something that we're really not sure what it is. But it describes it as dazzling white, and something was happening. And right before them appeared both Moses and Elijah. The I would imagine the three disciples were in awe. And Peter, of course, begins to talk, and he begins to describe how he's excited about being there. Who wouldn't be? And then he says, let's build a shelter, which is a kind of a monument for the three of you, Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. And the voice says, no, you listen to Jesus. So how Peter, James, and John knew it was Moses and Elijah, I have never figured out. And I've never had anyone be able to explain it to me. In Israel, they had no carvings, no stones, because they did not like idols. They didn't even have paintings. And I'm pretty sure they did not have a smartphone to take a photograph. So how would they know what Moses looked like? They did. And so they did. And so Moses was standing there. Moses and Elijah were talking with Jesus. And then suddenly they were all gone. The two were gone. Where is Moses standing when this event occurs? Have you ever thought about that? Moses is standing in the promised land, isn't he? That's where Jesus was when that occurred. So Moses did make it there, didn't he? But how did he get there? Did he cross the Jordan? We had seen and heard of Moses. Moses was buried on the other side of the Jordan. But how did Moses get there? And the answer is by the transforming power of Jesus. And this is actually now literal. Jesus has changed forms. And with that, his power, he brought Moses and Elijah to the promised land. That is the awesome end of that story. As great as Moses was, and he has almost no equal, certainly in the Old Testament, he was not able to enter the promised land on his own merits. Isn't that amazing? He wasn't good enough. His own actions were inadequate. They were not able to do it to get him to the promised land. Only by the transforming power of Jesus Christ was Moses able to enter the promised land. We're all inadequate. And I can tell you, if Moses wasn't good enough, I am confident that you and I are not good enough either. If Moses is not good enough and could not enter the promised land, we are in trouble. We are in serious trouble. But what we have seen from these shadows is that a new way is coming. That Jesus himself will stand in, he will account for Moses, and he will call him in. So it goes back to the first shadow we talked about. Are you marked by the blood to be spared being left out of the promised land? We will not enter heaven by how good we are, or how many steps we've accomplished, or all that we think we know, and all that we act, or how many classes you teach, or how often you go to church, or how much you give. All those things are important, but not as the result of getting you to heaven. They are important because we're grateful for that opportunity to go. Our only hope is in the blood of Jesus. Our actions are important, and I don't want to ever give you that impression that our actions are not relevant. Moses did have to strike the rock, and Moses did have to speak to the rock. Those don't sound like difficult solutions to thirst for thousands and thousands of people. If Moses had been asked to dig a deep well, that would have required great effort, skill, engineering, a lot of work. But he only asked them to speak to the rock, or in the first case, to strike the rock. The things that we're able to do are just that simple. They don't seem simple to us, and they certainly, our emotions get to us like they get to Moses. We get frustrated, and we decided that that is not the best way. But it's always the right way. Our parables repeatedly talk about the things that we do. We just studied that the last few months. If you look over and over, it's about what you do. What did you do with the money that God gave you? What did you do with the house you built? Did you build it on the rock? So what you do is important. The The difference is why we do these things, not what we do, why we do them. If we do them trusting the Lord, and sometimes it doesn't make sense, does it? Does turn the other cheek sound like a smart response? Do you know how many movies have been made in conflict with turn the other cheek? I bet a third of the movies produced in our world today have revenge or settling a score of some sort as part of its theme. That's what we celebrate. That's why it doesn't make sense. That's why it takes faith, and our faithful actions depend on trust that God knows better. I don't know what Moses thought, and he seemed upset, but speaking to the rock was the right answer. The question is, will we speak to that rock too? Will we trust the Lord to speak, or will we result to crucifying him all over again by our actions? Every time we substitute our emotions, our anger, our intelligence, our reasoning, our desires, our judgment, our good sense, every time we substitute those things for God's instructions, we are not trusting the Lord, and we're crucifying our Lord a second time. Well, this was one of my favorites. I discovered this complete set a couple years ago. I've always enjoyed it. It's, to me, a fascinating and deep one. But that is the shadow of Moses getting water from the rock. Next week, look forward to having you back. We're going to read a short book, a whole book, Ruth. Story often taught in elementary programs as well. She is a great example of faith. She is going to be the great, no, I don't know how many greats there are. There's a bunch of greats. Grandmother of Jesus himself. So we look forward to that. We're going to talk about her. And if you would read the book of Ruth this week and ask yourself, before we watch this class, where is Jesus in this story? Because I can tell you he is there. Do you have the ability to recognize our Lord in the world or in the scriptures? I hope you have a great week. I look forward to seeing you. Hope to see some of you Sunday. If you are unable, unwilling, I fully understand. Everyone's got concerns and issues, and we all need to make a faithful decision about our responses. But for those, send me a note if you like. I'd love to talk to you. I hope you have a great week. Look at Ruth. Find Jesus in the book of Ruth. It's the entire story is going to shadow what our Savior will one day do. I hope you have a great week. Thank you very much.